Look, today I want to look at the Gaza situation by talking about collective punishment. Now, there couldn't be a greater contrast than me standing here in this peaceful rural setting with the wind blowing through the leaves and what's been happening in Gaza in the last 5 months. And let's not forget, Gaza was the world's biggest prison. It's about 1/3 the size of Melbourne. So collective punishment. Now those of us who are older would be aware of the concept of collective punishment, especially in school where somebody did something wrong and everything was kept behind until the culprit owned up or somebody pointed out the culprit. That's the concept of collective punishment, that if somebody does something wrong, everybody is responsible and will suffer. Now, I think there's a few things that we need to understand about the carnage. I don't use the word war. I mean, war to me is what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, where both sides have tanks and they have planes and they have drones and they have missiles and they have servicemen and women. Now, irrespective of what you think of Hamas, the fact is they were elected by the people of Gaza as their representatives. Not everybody obviously voted for Hamas, but a significant number did. Now, why were they elected? They were elected because over the last 3/4 of a century, we have seen one of the greatest injustices of the modern world, when the Palestinians were displaced from their homes forcefully at the point of a gun to allow the creation of the Israeli state. Now, irrespective of what type of a history book you read, where you go on the net, I can assure you no one blames the Palestinians for the Holocaust. The Holocaust, the death, the murder, the mass murder, the industrial scale murder of over 6 million Jews, as well as 1 million gypsies and disabled people, and people with certain sexual predilections. The fact is, the Palestinians were not responsible for the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a European issue. It was European governments which created the situation where Jewish people were considered to be non-human. And obviously a lot of this stems from Christianity, the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago, evicting the Jewish people from their homeland because of their resistance to the Roman occupation. It was common in those days, if a group of people revolted more than once, that the men would be killed and the women and children would be sold into slavery, and that's what happened. That was 2,000 years ago. So the Palestinians were asked to, by the West, by European powers, including Australia, to bear the cost of something they were not responsible for. Now, when Hamas was elected in 2016 as the representatives of the Gazan people, the people living in Gaza who are Palestinians, they're not some separate entity. They are Palestinians who've been forced to live, 2.3 million people in an area 1/3 the size of Melbourne for generations. Now, let's not forget that Hamas was a creation of the Israeli state and the Israeli Secret Service. Initially, it was a creation. It was their creation because they wanted to break the power. The Palestinian Liberation Organisation had politically, socially and culturally in Palestine, and to a significant degree it worked initially. And we now see two movements as far as Palestinian liberation is concerned in Palestine. The Palestinian Liberation Organisation, Hamas, who rule with the consent of the people in Gaza. But the dilemma is, we need to remember that Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, is supposed to be one of the most sophisticated secret services in the world. We need to remember when Hamas militants broke out of Gaza on the 7th of October 2023 and were involved in horrific crimes in southern Israel, including murder, kidnapping. The fact is, this should never have happened. If the Israeli security had been doing their job, they would have known that this was going to happen. And if the Israeli armed forces, many of whom were captured on that day, were doing their job, this wouldn't happen. And the reason it happened is because of greed. Because the fascist Israeli government, and that's all it is, a fascist government, which is elected by its people. Let's not forget that. That fascist government was elected by its people. And what it's doing today, it's doing it at the behest of its people. But the fact is, it was too busy expanding Israeli settlements into Palestinian territory, whether it was East Jerusalem or whether it was the West Bank. They were too busy expanding their settlements. There's over now 1 million Israelis living illegally on occupied Palestinian land. They are too busy making money. They are too busy showing off how tough they were to actually defend the Israeli people. And when this carnage ends, and it will end, this government, this Israeli government, needs to be held to account by the people who elected it. Narrow victory, but it was a victory. It was an electoral victory. And they are working on behalf of the Israeli people, who as conscripts are involved in the atrocities which occurred in Gaza, because Gaza has now become a scene of collective punishment. You can't have over 30,000 people killed, mostly civilians. Although the Israeli army claims 10,000 were Hamas militants, I assume every adult male they've killed, they've said is a Hamas militant. You've got to remember that 40% of those who were killed are children under 14, of the 30,000. And that hospitals, mosques, churches have been destroyed. That we've seen carpet bombing. And now we are now seeing famine used as a weapon. Because we've seen the United Nations pushed out of its ability to provide aid to the Gazan people, who are nothing more than hostages to the Israeli state and the current Israeli government, which can do what it likes when it likes. As we saw a few days ago, when over 100 Palestinians were killed, when a private contractor who'd given a contract by the Israeli government was delivering aid to North Gaza. Now we think that all the Palestinians are in Rafah in South Gaza. They're not. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians still living in the rubble. Men, women and children, short of water, short of food. And when you see the United States President giving the okay for food drops to occur from US planes, you begin to understand the extent of the carnage. Now, if the North Koreans were doing this, or the Chinese, or the Russians were responsible for this in the Ukraine, I can imagine the outcry, not just amongst the politicians, but amongst the people of those countries and in the media of that country. We would never hear the end of it because it's Palestinians in Gaza and Israel, supposedly our ally. The best the Australian government could do when 100 people were shot dead, the majority were shot dead or died as a result of a stampede. I mean, if people are shooting at you, you're going to run. The best the Australian government can do was ask the Israeli ambassador. Didn't call the Israeli ambassador in, didn't expel the Israeli ambassador, didn't send the Israeli ambassador back to Israel. Because Israel, through its actions, is making its people pariahs. It's making its people pariahs in the international community. It's already a pariah in the Middle East. And irrespective of what happens in Gaza and the settlement which will eventually occur, the fact is what the Israeli government wants to do is force the Gazans into Egypt. So it doesn't have a Palestinian problem. Egypt then has a Palestinian problem, as it forced hundreds of thousands to Lebanon when Yasser Arafat was leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. And it wants to force the Palestinians living in the West Bank into Jordan, because it believes that the only way it will resolve this is the current government, its Palestinian problem, is to expel every Palestinian from what they claim is Israeli territory. So collective punishment is the type of process, the type of strategy, tactic, which is used by authoritarian regimes. Stalin was very good at it. He used to deport hundreds of thousands of people from one side of the Soviet Empire to the other side of the Soviet Empire because they showed resistance to Russian imperialism. We saw it during the Nazi era, when collective punishment was the name of it. So, what's the least that can be done? What's the very least that can be done? What's the very least that can be done? Well, the very least that can be done is that the Israeli ambassador should be recalled from Israel to Australia until aid is allowed into Gaza by the United Nations. Why should the United Nations be excluded from providing aid? Unfortunately, as we know, the United Nations is dominated by the major sovereign nation states who have a power of veto: Russia, China, England, France, and the United States. They have a veto. And anybody who believes in world government really needs to see the way that the United Nations works. It is nothing more but a creature of sovereign nation states, a little bit like local councils in Australia, which are creatures of state governments. At the very least, the Australian government should recall its ambassador from Jerusalem until aid is restored by the United Nations. The other thing that should happen is that the aid which was stopped by the Australian government because of suggestions by the Israeli army that 8 people who were involved in the attack in southern Israel were members of the United Nations relief team, needs to be reverted and aid needs to be increased. Now obviously, Mr. Biden, faced with a presidential election and an increasing revulsion at what's happening in Gaza by an increasing number of people in the United States and the West, understands that some solution needs to occur now. The other issue is weapons. Israel relies on purchasing weapons from around the world. Those weapons supplies should dry up. Now, it's one thing to have the right to defend yourself. It's another thing to be involved in campaigns which are little more than war crimes, where collective punishment becomes the norm of the day. Now, collective punishment in any war situation is a war crime, let alone the carpet bombing, the indiscriminate killing of civilians. Now, in every war, and all wars eventually come to an end in one way or another, and this is not a war, as I said before, this is carnage. In every military conflict, in every civil conflict, people get tired of the bloodshed, and there are pivotal moments where attitudes change on the part of the aggressors. We saw this in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where support for the war in the United States and Australia dropped dramatically. We are now seeing this in the carnage that's occurring in Gaza, with the shooting deaths, the machine gunning deaths of over 100 people trying to get aid for themselves and their families. This is a totally untenable situation, and it's been created by the West, by our support for the Israeli government. Not in terms of its having the ability to defend itself, it has that ability, but it was asleep at the wheel when the attack occurred. To think that Hamas could launch such a huge, devastating attack on the Israeli state and the Israeli people without Mossad, without the Israeli government knowing anything about it, is beyond anybody's imagination. I'm confident Hamas never thought that they would find themselves in that situation. Obviously, this current government is more interested in land grab. It's more interested in expanding its empire. It's more interested in pursuing a policy of pushing every Palestinian out of the Israeli state. And possibly with changes in legislation we are seeing, even those Palestinians that have Israeli citizenship are at threat. Because although some Palestinians have Israeli citizenship, and there is some minimal representation in the Knesset, the problem is that if the Palestinians in the Gaza are pushed out, and then the Palestinians in the West Bank are pushed out, and then the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are pushed out, with this particular government in power, we will see legislation which will disenfranchise those Palestinians which currently have Israeli citizenship. But more importantly, now the carnage needs to stop, and we need to demand of our governments to stop supplying military aid to Israel. And we should be demanding that anybody seeing this video should be demanding that their government withdraws their ambassadors from Israel. If there's one thing the Israeli people need to understand, is that without support outside their borders, their future as an independent, sovereign nation state is at a greater risk than ever before.